LeeAnna Warner's case has stumped law enforcement for 2 decades now. In early 2003, which was actually just a few months before LeeAnna vanished, she and her parents, along with her sister Carly, moved 10 minutes up north to Chisholm. And for those first few months, everything was as normal as ever. So that brings us to the day that LeeAnna disappeared. Her mom, Kaylin, decided to take Carly and LeeAnna out to some garage sales. And then after they shopped around for a little while, because it was such a nice day out, they ended up driving over to a friend's house where they played and also swam before finally returning home just before 4:30 p.m. And both girls come up to her while she's unloading the car, and they wanted to walk over to their friends' houses. And just to be clear, these are 2 different houses, 2 different friends, and they're both close to their house. LeeAnna just really wanted to go to her friend's house, was begging her mom, and the friend was only a block and a half away, so she figured why not. But she did tell them that they needed to be back by 5, which left them with only 30 minutes to go and play. And so they each walked over to their friends' houses, and really nobody had any reason to believe that LeeAnna was in any danger. But when 5 o'clock rolled around, only Carly came back home. And at first, her mom wasn't too nervous because, LeeAnna's only 5 years old. She figured she probably just lost track of time. So she ends up sending Carly over to this friend's house, the Cork family. And she did. And then when she came back just a couple minutes later, she tells her mom that nobody is at the Cork family house. They were actually out shopping at a Target 30 minutes away. But regardless, she decided to go over to that house anyway to see for herself. But all she found were LeeAnna's shoes, which wasn't too strange. The idea that she is just around the neighborhood started to fade, and the concern really started to set in. So Kaylin and Carly started making their way around the neighborhood, calling out her name, knocking on doors. But besides the shoes, there were no signs of her. So she ends up calling Chris, and he's working for a local ambulance service at the time, and she lets him know what's going on. And that's when she really starts to feel panicked. So just before 9 p.m., they reported LeeAnna missing to the Chisholm Police Department, and a large-scale search effort kicked off right away. That same night, a team of law enforcement officers began looking for LeeAnna, and they started at the Warners' home and worked their way outward. But for the most part, it was all a dead end. And I say for the most part because there were 2 neighbors who had spotted her that night. And the first witness was a man who lived next door to the Cork family. And he said that around 5:15, he saw LeeAnna as she walked up to the Cork store and began knocking. So we know that she did go there. But then after that, he ended up going inside his house, and that's all that he saw. The second witness was another man who lived across the street, and he said he saw LeeAnna around that same time. And according to what he shared with investigators, they believe that after nobody answered the door, LeeAnna crossed the street and began walking by this man's house. And this witness basically said that he was outside working on his car, and that when he saw LeeAnna walking by, he was worried that his puppy was going to jump on her. And so, to make sure that the puppy didn't jump on her, he went inside and grabbed a leash, and by the time he came back outside, she was gone. This man was cleared 100% by law enforcement and had no involvement. But honestly, what sticks out to me most with all of this is the timing of it all. I mean, it really doesn't make sense. If LeeAnna had left her house at 4:30, and walked over to her friend's house, which would only have taken a few minutes, but both of these neighbors saw her at 5:15, that's 45 minutes where we have no idea where she was or what she was doing. Plus, that also means if these 2 sightings are accurate, that her mom and sister just missed her because they started searching for her at 5:30. The search went on into that night, and once it got dark, the St. Louis County Rescue Squad and local fire department were called in to help as well. A state patrol helicopter also joined the search, and they used some heat sensors to try to find out if maybe she was somewhere that they couldn't see in the dark. They even got a bloodhound out there, which is great. I mean, bloodhounds are amazing at tracking scents. But even if they do find a scent, they obviously cannot communicate to you or obviously even know when the scent was left there. So in this case, the dog did end up picking up LeeAnna's scent, which seemed like great news at the time, but they ended up figuring out that the scent he picked up was from the day before. Specifically, the dog ended up bringing investigators down by the lake, and when they were there, they came across a child's footprint down by the water. Investigators learned from Carly, her sister, that she and LeeAnna had been down by the water playing that Friday in the exact same spot. So literally the day before. But with no sign of LeeAnna anywhere, no idea where she could be, the idea that she had just wandered off and was somewhere around the area seemed less and less likely. Even though it was extremely difficult for them to all face this reality, the idea that someone had taken her, that there was some sort of foul play here, seemed more likely by this point. And that weekend, there was actually a jazz festival and a motorcycle rally that had come through Chisholm, and obviously that increased the amount of visitors, tourists in the area, which increased the number of possible suspects. Thousands of tips started pouring in, and investigators were not ruling anyone or anything out. And of course, one of the first things they did is look into the offender registry to see how many offenders were in their area. Turns out that there were 130 of them in a city of less than 5,000. And person by person, investigators corroborated their alibis to see if anyone on that registry was involved. And just based on where things are today, it doesn't sound like anyone really caught their attention. The search and investigation did not stop. Kaylin and Chris were looked into as possible suspects and cleared, which is still true, but they ended up providing investigators with some interesting information about LeeAnna in the weeks leading up to her disappearance. I guess a few weeks before everything happened, LeeAnna came home one day with this case of Barbies and Barbie clothes. And so, of course, they ask her about this random case of Barbies and Barbie clothes. And she tells them that a little old lady gave them to her. And at first they brushed this off. You know, they're thinking that maybe she had taken it from somewhere, taken it from a friend's house and just told them this story. But now that she was gone, it felt like maybe there was more to that story than they knew at the time. And there's more too. Actually, a week before LeeAnna disappeared, she told her family that she was running away. She had actually packed up a suitcase and said that she was going to go live with her new family. I mean, she was 5 years old, and like most children, she had a wild imagination, and they just didn't think there was any truth to the things that she was saying. But like I said, now that she was gone, they started thinking that maybe there was some truth to some of the things that she was telling them. I will say that police did take these concerns very seriously, but at the same time, they also said they didn't find any evidence to suggest that LeeAnna had been, which doesn't mean she wasn't. I mean, sometimes there's not always evidence for that. So that summer, while investigators were continuing to go through the offender registry, another tip came in that caught their attention. The call came from a woman who lived right down the street from the Warners, and she said that they needed to look into her son. It turns out that this woman's boyfriend was using their family computer, and he found CP, photos of children. And what's crazy is her son, whose name is Matthew Curtis, actually had already been interviewed by police a few days after LeeAnna went missing. And at the time, he claimed to know nothing about what happened to LeeAnna. But with this new information coming to light, the CP on the computer, several red flags were raised. Actually, all the red flags were raised. So investigators got a search warrant for his laptop and ended up charging him in connection with what they found. And of course, they also heavily questioned him about LeeAnna. And that was definitely the right move, considering that he only lived a few houses down from where she did. Anyway, though, he continued to deny any connection to LeeAnna's disappearance. But he did say something super, super weird, very off-putting and bizarre. And I've heard people say things like this in the past, but he said that even if he did, they wouldn't be able to find her. But what makes it all even worse is that he ended up taking his own life. It was actually on the day that he was supposed to appear in court on the possession of CP charges that his body was found in a gravel pit with a plastic bag over his head. Investigators got a call from Bruce Christensen saying that he was responsible for what happened to LeeAnna. He ended up going to jail on some unrelated charges, and while he was there, he called up investigators and said he was ready to talk. Now, of course, this brings up a lot of emotion, but this just ended up being a false confession. Turns out that Bruce had actually someone in jail and was now facing an additional 30 years behind bars. And in an attempt to get outside one last time, he lied about killing LeeAnna. He literally went out with a team of investigators and led them to an unmarked grave And when they dug up this grave, it ended up just being the remains of a cat. It was all just a ploy that he used to get outside one last time at their expense. And once again, investigators are back to square one. Now, Chief Vern Manor, who has worked the case since 2003, says that every year they get tips. And some are better than others, but they're continuing to this day to follow up on everything they receive. Her family, the community, and law enforcement have never given up hope and have never closed the case to this day.